Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Wilden, and it is my honor and delight to be the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. We welcome all of our OLLI members here today, as well as OLLI members from across the country. We're delighted to have you here today. We have over 200 people on this program today. So we absolutely encourage questions and comments, but we do ask that you make them in the chat box. And after the conversation between Nick Carr and Ethan Zuckerman, Ben Sosny will be helping to moderate your questions and comments from the program. This program was developed by the Tech Impact Forum, which is a group that was begun by a group of OLLI members, retired people from a variety of fields, including education and science and business and more, who wanted to explore the future of technology and what it meant for the Berkshires and the rest of the world. And we were delighted to partner with One Berkshire, which serves as the Chamber of Commerce and the Visitors Bureau and the Creative Economy Organization all in one here in Berkshire County, as well as with the Berkshire Innovation Center, which is exactly what it sounds like, a center for innovation here in the Berkshires, which opened in February 2020, just 1 month before the pandemic and the quarantining began. Originally, we were planning to do a in-person conference, but our plans have morphed into a wonderful 8-session course that we had on the future of technology this fall, and now this lecture series this winter. And it is my honor and delight now to introduce Ben Sosny, who's the Executive Director of the Berkshire Innovation Center, who has been our wonderful partner in these offerings to our community. The Berkshire Innovation Center seeks to expand the innovation capacity in the region by providing advanced capabilities to technology-enabled companies, startups, and advanced manufacturers, and works with everyone from high school kids to OLLI members and in between to raise up the knowledge level and access to technology in the Berkshires. Prior to joining the Berkshire Innovation Center, Ben served for 3 years as General Counsel and Senior Project Manager for EMRCA in North Adams under the leadership of Thomas Krenz, working on some really innovative museum possibilities for Northern Berkshires, right? Did they do other super secret stuff that you can't tell us about?
Very super secret.
Ben's a Berkshire County native, and before moving back to the Berkshires with his family in 2015, he spent 7 years as a principal court attorney for the Appellate Division, 2nd Department in Brooklyn. So Ben's going to introduce our speakers today, and it is with great pleasure that I hand over the mic to him. Ben?
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Nick and Ethan, for joining us. My pleasure to be here and to introduce these two gentlemen, and thanks to OLLI and their fearsome foursome, as they've come to be known, who are driving this whole initiative. Want to move quickly and make sure Ethan and Nick get their time here. So. Many of you know them, but Nicholas Carr is an acclaimed writer whose work focuses at the intersection of technology, economics, and culture. His books include the Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, which has been translated into more than 25 languages. He is a visiting professor of sociology at Williams College and was the former executive editor of the Harvard Business Review. The Shallows was a New York Times bestseller when it was first published in 2010 and remains a touchstone for debates on technology's effects on our thoughts and perceptions. His 2014 book, The Glass Cage, Automation and Us, examines the personal and societal consequences of our ever-growing dependency on computers, robots, and apps. And his latest book, Utopia is Creepy, collects his best essays, blog posts, and other writings. Carr's written for many newspapers, magazines, and journals, including The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and MIT Tech Review. He also hosts a popular blog. Holds a BA from Dartmouth and an MA from Harvard. Perhaps overshadowed by all that he's accomplished since, I think it's important to note that Carr was also the founding member of a punk rock band in Connecticut in the early 1980s, which we could explore later if he's up for it. Ethan Zuckerman is an associate professor of public policy, communications, and information at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He is the founder of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, a research group that is studying and building alternatives to the existing commercial internet. He's the author of 2 books, Mistrust, Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them, and Rewire, Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connections. Zuckerman directed the Center for Civic Media at MIT from 2011 to 2020 and has long been considered one of the leading thinkers at the intersection of technology, politics, and society. He has a long history of creating platforms and organizations that use technology to raise new voices. Just a few examples: his Media Cloud platform enabled scholars at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center to analyze and critique mainline coverage of the 2016 election, and Global Voices, which he co-founded in 2005, promotes free speech online across the globe. As many of you around the Berkshires know, in the mid-1990s, Ethan and some friends at Williamstown built one of the first pure .com companies, Tripod, which was later sold to Lycos. Although he will disclaim full responsibility, Ethan will acknowledge that he bears at least some of the blame for all those annoying pop-up windows that we all deal with to this day. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. And Ethan, take us away.
Thanks so much, Ben. And thank you to Megan and to Kathy Kidd and everyone at OLLI who was involved with putting this together. Nick and I had talked about just getting together between his house in Williamstown, my house in Lanesboro. We had settled on doing this outside in a roadside rest area in New Ashford. It's much, much better to be doing it with OLLI in front of all of you. And we really thank you for coming out. In seriousness, it's really an honor to share a stage with Nick, whose writing I've admired for so long, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Let me tell you just a little bit about this book and the very strange moment that I find myself in. I think Nick will tell you that when you're writing a book, it's often a project closer to a decade than a year. And I started working on Mistrust about 7 or 8 years ago. I had no idea that the ideas that I would be talking about would be directly connected to moments like the riot at the US Capitol or resistance to a coronavirus vaccine, 2 phenomena that have a lot to do with mistrust in contemporary American life. I actually started writing Mistrust not as a reaction to the presidency of Donald Trump, despite the fact that Trump has really weaponized mistrust, taken people's lack of faith in institutions and turned it almost into a political stance. I was actually writing this before Trump had really returned to the public stage, when he was still this sort of weird legacy from the 1980s who would show up occasionally on TV to promote the birther conspiracy. I wrote Mistrust as a gift for my students at MIT. I ran a lab at MIT called the Center for Civic Media, and I inherited the name. And one of the things I discovered very early was that the word civics could be toxic to young people. As soon as I mentioned civics, this idea of trying to figure out how to have an impact in your world, whether it was around local politics, whether it was around activism, whether it was around social change of one fashion or another, and started talking about this in terms of civic processes, people would tune out. And I realized that this was not that the people that I was working with weren't interested in social change. Actually, in many cases, they were tremendous activists who were working very, very hard on changing different parts of the world. They simply had very little faith in existing civic processes. And this idea that electing candidates to office or passing legislation was the way to make change didn't really appeal to them. They found themselves much more drawn to movements like the Occupy movement, which was sort of falling apart when I started writing this book, and then later to movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And I decided to take my students and these friends seriously, to assume that they weren't lazy or ignorant, but maybe they understood something that very serious people didn't understand about how change making is happening in the world today. And that's what actually led me to start studying mistrust. I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with progressive foundations. I've worked with George Soros, I've worked with the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. And what you find with a lot of these foundations that are trying to make change is they have theories of change that come from the civil rights movement. They look back to that remarkable moment in the 1950s and the 1960s where we saw people, the court system, the legislature, and the executive all move together, people first, institutions a little bit later, but to take some really bold steps towards a more radically just society, inclusive of people of all races. Many of the elders in the activist movements that I work with take not only their inspiration from the civil rights movement, but their tactics and their strategies. And so they're very, very interested in making change through getting legislation passed through Congress, through winning court cases, and the techniques they use often are directly related to those perceived outcomes. But here's a key difference. At the height of the civil rights movement, 1964, when you polled Americans and said, do you trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time? 70% of Americans would say, yes, we trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time. That number collapses through the 1970s. By the time we get to the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency in 1980, the number of people who trust the government is 26%. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that. There's a lot that changes in the 70s, the Vietnam War, Watergate, the energy crisis. So you have an enormous shift and good reasons for it, but we've never quite recovered from that shift. So that Carter line, 26% of Americans trusting in the government, we have not been above that line since shortly after 9/11. We had a big wave of confidence in government right before we invaded Iraq. We've gone down ever since. All of Obama, all of Trump, we've been under 20% confidence. And it's not just trust in the government. That would be one thing if we simply mistrusted Congress and the executive. If you survey Americans, we show low levels of trust and levels that have fallen sharply since the 1970s in institutions of all sorts. And I define an institution as anything where it doesn't really matter who the individual is in charge of it, where an institution is about the processes and the procedures rather than the individual personalities. And across the board, when you ask Americans about institutions, you ask about banks, you ask about schools, you ask about churches, you ask about the media, our confidence has collapsed over the last few decades. And this represents a real challenge for civics. We tend to have two basic models of civics in the United States. We have a model that we're all taught in school, or perhaps not taught well enough, where a bill becomes a law and we elect people to office and people of good character can make change in the world. But if you don't believe that Congress can really get anything done, and frankly, Congress right now has a 9% approval rating. If you think that Congress or the structure behind it is broken, and no matter who's sitting in that seat, it can be very hard to persuade someone that that's the way to make change in the world. The flip side, we tend to teach a protest model of civics, and this very much comes out of the civil rights movement. If we don't like it, we can take to the streets, and the people in government will have to listen to our voices. But the truth is, when that model has been most successful is at other moments where we had high confidence in government, right? The March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, it's a march on Washington. It was strategically planned to put pressure on John F. Kennedy to make strides on civil rights. And Kennedy had actually talked to leaders ahead of time, hoping that the march and attention to it would put pressure on him. Contrast that to the march that happened around Trump's inauguration, where an unprecedented number of women and their allies came to march for women's rights. That was not a moment where anyone expected Donald Trump to be persuaded or swayed by that sort of display in the streets. So at a moment of low trust in institutions, you have a real problem. It can be really hard to try to make a change through the legislature. It can be really hard to protest people in power unless your goal is to actually overthrow them. And what I was interested in was, what does civics look like from the perspective of people who are frustrated with existing institutions, but don't believe in burning it all down? And this is where things get a little tricky. I borrowed two terms from Chris Hayes, the commentator on MSNBC, who wrote a very, very thoughtful book about social change around 10 years ago. He makes the argument that rather than thinking of politics just in terms of left and right, we need to think of it in terms of insurrectionist and institutionalist. And for Hayes and for me, institutionalists are people who join these institutions and try to make incremental changes within them and believe that if those institutions just got a little bit stronger, the world would be a better place. Insurrectionists, from this point of view, look at those institutions and say, this institution just isn't working anymore. And we might need to really rethink it. In fact, in some cases, we might need to get rid of the institution and build another one in its place. Now, it's important to note that when we're talking about insurrectionism in this sense, we are not talking about the people who violated the Capitol on January 6th. First of all, they weren't trying to build a new institution. And second of all, they were actually just trying to keep Trump in place, right? That's actually a deeply conservative thing to do. And it's a violent movement, whereas the insurrectionists that I'm looking at in this are people who are looking at institutions and saying, can we find a way to build a better institution in its place? So I'm really interested in people who are positioning themselves either to hold these institutions accountable by sort of standing outside of them and pressuring them through things like journalism or things like watching police arrests or by exposing corruption within institutions. I'm very interested in people who are willing to go into an institution and try to bring it back to its core values. Right now, we're seeing a big movement around progressive prosecutors, people in the district attorney's office, who are trying rather to focus the criminal justice system, one of the systems that is the least trusted and maybe justifiably the least trusted, and bring it back to values of justice rather than actually focusing on very high levels of incarceration. And then finally, I'm really interested in people who are looking at systems and saying, have we reached a point where fixing this system is no longer the thing to do and we actually need to replace it? An example of that might be the Black Lives Matter movement, looking at cases where defunding police might make sense to create a nonviolent form of public safety, not getting rid of police entirely, but creating a new sort of institution to deal with things like domestic violence, which the police often aren't very good at doing. Can we take an institution and try a radical rethinking of it? So this book looks at a toolkit that activists can use that's much broader than civics as we're taught in school. It's a kit that doesn't just include passing laws and electing people, it also includes building new technologies, using market mechanisms, and maybe most importantly, trying to change hearts and minds through social norms. And one of the reasons I think this is particularly important is, first of all, for young people, trying to build campaigns around changing hearts and minds seems to be something that they're often doing with social media. There's also evidence that perhaps this works. When we look at the question of equal marriage for gay and lesbian people, this is a change that in some ways parallels interracial marriage in the 1950s. But public attitudes are very, very different. When Loving versus Virginia is settled by the Supreme Court, only about 10% of Americans support interracial marriage. By the time the Oberfelge case is settled, making gay and lesbian marriage legal, you have about 70% support for equal marriage. It's possible now that instead of the court leading social norms are leading the court and leading the government. And so trying to directly work on social norms on a campaign like Black Lives Matter or like Me Too may be a way to make real change. So the argument that I try to make in the book is that it's okay to be frustrated with institutions, particularly institutions that are not functioning well. That it's legitimate to look for a way either to go within an institution and try to make it better, or if you can't find ways to make the institution better, to ask that very hard question: do we actually need a very different sort of institution? Do we need that sort of fundamental change where an institution is no longer fit for purpose and we might have to create something new within its path? What's not okay is looking at this position of very high mistrust in government, very high mistrust in all institutions, and deciding to disengage, because that's how we end up with a disempowered populace. So that's the core argument of the book. Nick, I'm really looking forward to where you want to push me on this, and questions that might have come up for you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ethan. And first of all, congratulations on such a timely book. It may have been in the works for 10 years, but it came out at a point where I think the cross currents of mistrust and trying to figure it out is uppermost in all of our minds. You'd mentioned the anti-vaccine movement, and I want to ask you about that. But before I do that, I want to come back to what you were just talking about, with kind of how do we think about insurrectionists? Mm-hmm. And to push back a little, you seem to say, well, the Capitol Hill rioters don't really fit that model because they were simply trying to keep Trump in power. But I think if you look at it from their perspective, I think they very much saw themselves as trying to, as coming up against an institution, the federal government, that to them had been corrupted by the deep state. And so they were kind of acting, I think they were trying to express some core values that they were trying to reform this institution. And I'm certainly not saying that because I'm sympathetic with them, certainly not sympathetic with how they went about it, but it seems to pull up an important point. And this kind of runs through your book, which is that everything comes down to the values and the beliefs that people hold. And you can take the tools of activism that you talk about very eloquently and compellingly in the book, and you can use them for good purposes, and you can use them just as effectively for bad purposes. Absolutely. And you can, different people can have different views of what does it mean for an institution to be corrupt, and what does it mean for an institution to thrive. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little about this tension that, particularly in the world we live in, and with media the way it is, that you can take these tools, and even the entire concept of insurrection that can be used, as I say, for very constructive purposes. But if you start off with a very different set of assumptions, you're gonna end up with thoughts and actions that might run very much contrary to what you're arguing, or at least.
Let's talk about those assumptions, because I think that actually helps us sort of understand what's going on in the January 6th situation. One of the chapters of the book tries to figure out, why has mistrust increased since the 1960s? And there's a bunch of hypotheses out there. There are people who argue that we're a lot better educated, a lot better informed, increased amounts of schooling, increased access to information, including through the internet. There's an argument that inequality keeps rising. And we can certainly see that economically in the United States, as more and more people feel like they're getting the short end of the stick. They end up feeling like the whole system is working against them, and that having confidence in a system that isn't working well for them doesn't make a lot of sense. There is the argument that we lose trust in institutions when they fail us. And we can see, when we look at trust in organized religion, there's an enormous fall in trust when we see the Catholic Church sex abuse scandals. There's an enormous decrease in trust in big business with the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. One of the things that I didn't write about, or I don't write enough about, is this idea that mistrust can be synthesized. And that's a huge amount of what we've seen happen over the last 4 years. It's not uncommon to run for office in the United States as an outsider. We've seen, Ross Perot, for those who can remember that far back, or John Anderson. We see people periodically coming in and saying, I'm not a standard politician, I'm outside of the system. Bernie Sanders has made this argument by virtue of being identified as a socialist, despite, being in elected office, essentially his entire adult life. What's uncommon, though, is to try to govern as an outsider. And what Trump did was essentially take office and say, not what people normally say, which is, okay, I'm in power now trust the system. Instead, what Trump said is, no, everything's against me and everything's against you. The deep state is trying to block me at every turn. News media is lying to you. You can't trust any of these institutions. You can only trust me. And mistrust is incredibly powerful fuel. I've started thinking of it, almost like gasoline. It's corrosive, it's potentially explosive, but it's also extremely powerful if you can sort of harness it. So I think what we saw on January 6th were people who have some of the same frustrations and mistrusts around things like inequality, who have an enormous amount of media telling them not to trust a system, that have misinformation supported by the Republican Party, all leading to a group of people, I think you're absolutely right, feeling like they were taking control back. What's hard about this is I don't want to create a false equivalency between those people who I think for the most part were badly manipulated and deceived, and people who are also starting insurrectionist movements. And I find myself watching people who are building movements against systemic racism or against sexual harassment, and not wanting to sort of consider them, coming from the same place. But as you point out, it's really complicated. And I think what we found in the last 4 years is that once you get to a very mistrustful society, people will try to find ways to manipulate it. And that's something that we absolutely have to anticipate and prepare for going forward. Mistrust is a force that is unlikely to drop out of our politics anytime soon.
Right. And I think that, I think that is the important point, that mistrust can certainly be a spur to constructive action and activism, but it can make people vulnerable to manipulation, because in some ways, the more mistrustful you are of existing institutions, the more you want to place your trust somewhere else. I think people want to trust something, and if your trust in institutions break down, you're going to look for something else, and that at that moment you become, susceptible to manipulation.
And just really quick on that, Nicholas, I had an experience with that, and I wonder if other people in the crowd will feel like they had an experience with that. In early March of last year, I was still getting on airplanes. And I remember flying out to Seattle, which had one of the first COVID outbreaks in early March, to give a talk, which is what I do all the time. I get on airplanes, I give talks, I fly back. And as I was getting on the airplane, I remember thinking, I really wish someone would tell me if this was okay. And of course, what was happening at that point was we were not getting a lot of guidance from the federal government as what to do around this. And so I ended up, leaning on another institution. I got back from Seattle and I landed in Boston. And as I got on the MIT campus where I was teaching at that point, MIT sent a note out to all faculty saying, essentially, you're grounded. Until we say otherwise, don't get on an airplane, don't get on a train. And it was so interesting because I had this feeling of relief. And part of it was that early on in COVID, it was really difficult to know how to make a choice like that. If you no longer have an institution that's sort of stepping up and taking its responsibility, the responsibility can fall on you. And that's incredibly challenging. And then sometimes what we're really looking for is another institution to step up and say, here's what to do, here's what to believe. Does MIT have a better idea than the US government of whether COVID is dangerous or not? Probably not at that point. But they were willing to sort of step up and say, look, we know, don't make this decision, at a moment when the government wasn't.
Yeah, and you may be looking for an alternative institution to trust in, but you may also, I think you can also see the seeds of cults of personality, where a big personality fills in for the institution that you used to put your trust in. But let me ask you about your opinion of the anti-vaccination movement, because I think it fits in with your kind of argument in a very interesting way. You know, the anti-vaccine movement, unlike almost everything else we see today, doesn't break down along polarized.
No, not at all. They're very strong on the left, actually.
It crosses right and left. It's all educational levels, I think. And it's been around for quite a long time, certainly before COVID, but it really seems, you know, at this moment to kind of be, for me, something that's very frustrating to watch. And it also, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about social media and its role in movements, good and bad. How do you interpret the anti-vaccine movement at this point? And particularly, you know, what's different now, and how much is the pandemic playing? How much is social media playing? You know, what's going on here?
Well, and I should just mention for people who haven't had the chance to read your work, you've been a very incisive, thoughtful critic of ways in which social media can interrupt some of our ways of normal thinking. I think it's absolutely fair to point to the anti-vax movement having roots in social media, or at the very least having used social media to reach much larger audiences. My lab actually does a lot of research on how ideas spread online. And we did a deep dive a few years ago into the anti-vax movement, and you won't be surprised to hear that we also see it as a mistrust phenomenon. The mistrust very specifically is not anti-science, and that surprised us, right? We thought that what was going on with anti-vax was people essentially saying, science isn't real, people are lying to us. What it actually is a movement that has deep mistrust of late-stage capitalism, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry. So people believe that pharma companies in particular are extremely manipulative or extremely dangerous. And if you have that belief, which by the way is probably more associated with leaning left than it is towards leaning right, you become open to interpreting data that people come in front of you with that essentially say, I don't know if you know, but these things just aren't very effective and they're very dangerous. What we found in our research was the people who were trying to reach anti-vaxxers would take a doctor and say, trust me, I'm a doctor, believe in science, and I will tell you that this is the way to go. And anti-vaxxers wouldn't be reading that. They'd actually be reading scientific papers on PubMed, but they'd be very selectively reading. They would be looking through to sort of choose which papers advance their arguments. And one of the things that's really important to sort of understand is that the human brain is a lawyer. It's not actually fairly evaluating situations. It knows what you want and what you think, and then it interprets information through that lens. So if you have the belief that you cannot trust big business, and this has gone to the point where you feel like, I can't trust mainstream pharma, you will then approach the information that you encounter online and you'll pull it in through that filter. And then there is a social media dynamic where as you are sort of sharing your doubts, other people are coming in and saying, hey, welcome, we're having this conversation as well. So 4 or 5 years ago, we were looking at this and seeing this population of quite well-educated, quite well-off, often left-leaning people who were involved with the anti-vax movement. What's really crazy in the last year is we've seen that community cross the stream with the QAnon community. So the QAnon community tends to be very, very conservative, very, very Christian, but very skeptical of almost everything. QAnon is a big tent conspiracy theory, but basically the one idea behind QAnon is nothing is as it seemed. So QAnon was incredibly open to people who were suspicious of the COVID vaccine, who, by the way, some were suspicious because they saw it as being pushed by Trump, much as he was pushing other solutions in the hopes of getting it off his back. Now we've seen, in some ways, a merger between the two, and this sort of notion that figures like Anthony Fauci are not only in the grip of big pharma, but are also in the grip of the big state. And for me, this is just a reminder of how scary this moment is. I don't know whether you've lost anyone to QAnon, but I've seen friends I know, including friends from high school, who've gone very far down that rabbit hole. And these are very smart people, but somewhere in the process, they have so little faith in some of these institutions in power that they've used that to construct a worldview that makes sense to them. And we are now living at a moment where it's very, very easy to find people who will support that worldview and who will feed you information to go along with it.
Yeah, it's also, it's kind of interesting that you point to kind of the anti-capitalist feelings underpinning at least some groups in the anti-vaccine movement, because if you look at this intersection of kind of conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine and QAnon and stuff, one of the aspects of this story is the commercialization of these things, that what a lot of people in a very cynical way, I think, have found is that you can use conspiracy theories to draw a big audience and then sell them stuff, supplements or whatever. And so there's this very bizarre kind of thing going on, you know, often on social media and stuff, where this is kind of a marketing pitch that draws in viewers that you can then sell them stuff. It's a very strange thing. But I want to bring up a subject that I find very interesting, and that I think you may disagree, but I think is related to this.
Go for it.
And that's what I believe is an erosion of patience through society. And I think this has actually been going on for a long time. You know, predates the internet. I think the media business in general does not want to encourage us to be patient, methodical, rational thinkers and spend a lot of time going through stuff. They've always wanted to grab us and keep us amused and diverted and stuff. And I think with digital media and the rise of social media and smartphones, now it's pretty much constant. We're carrying this around all the time. And we expect kind of stimulation all the time of different sorts. And I think what this means, one of the consequences, and I certainly feel it in my own life, is that it becomes harder and harder to sustain your attention on one kind of complex issue or whatever. And I think that this ties in to, you know, you were talking about how your students have kind of rolled their eyes at civics and stuff, and institutions. I think one of the reasons institutions don't get a lot of as much focus is because institutions, as you said, they're not personalities. They're very complex bureaucracies or whatever. And it actually takes a lot of time to figure out what's going on. How might I influence this institution? You really have to be patient. You have to figure things out. And I think this also, and this is something you touch on in your book, you know, the activism that comes out of social media or the internet, and certainly, you know, this is a powerful tool for mobilizing people. But there is one argument that says, you know, the problem here is that people get very, very excited and very emotionally attached because social media is all about grabbing people's emotions to a cause, to a movement, but then they don't have the stick-to-itiveness or whatever that word is that we might have seen in the past, where people weren't constantly stimulating, constantly interrupting, constantly distracted. So just, I'd like to hear your thoughts in general, but also kind of if you're interested in mobilizing, you know, a public force to make change in a very complex area that's going to require a lot of thinking, a lot of time. Is there a conflict between how people are getting information, getting entertainment and stuff, and the kind of focus that's required to really make deep changes.
Sure. So let's talk about patience, and let's talk about it actually as a bit of a double-edged sword. I think you're absolutely right that functioning institutions require a long time to figure out how they work. I think one of the things for many people who were worried about the Trump administration, this has been a lesson in how institutions function, when they don't function, where their vulnerabilities are, how strong, how weak they are. I saw a lot of people interested in social change become very strong institutionalists in the wake of the party they didn't support coming into power, because the hope was the institutions would stay some change from happening. And there certainly is an argument to be made that if you're going to try to radically change an institution, propose doing something a very different way, it's incumbent on you to understand what works, how it works, why it doesn't work. The flip side is that patience can often be sort of put forward as a way of essentially saying, kind of a Panglossian, this is the best that we're ever going to get. And what it fails to recognize a lot of the time is that institutions are in the business of self-preservation. They do things the way they do because that's what people in power are doing. That's how people learn to take that power. And people really don't want to lose that position or that authority. I think it's very, very helpful to be patient enough to understand what's the right approach to an institution. Is the right approach that this is an institution that just needs an influx of thoughtful people to build it up? Or is this an institution that's really got systemic problems that frankly we've known about for a very, very long time, and we actually need some form of radical change? And I'll come back to the criminal justice system on this one. I think it's been really interesting to watch people in DA's offices looking at this and saying, wait a second, we've known for a long time that we incarcerate too many people in the US. We've known that we don't do enough work diverting people into drug treatment programs. We know that our costs of incarceration keep going up, but there are aspects of the prosecutor's office that make it incredibly hard to break out of. No one wants to be seen as the prosecutor who's not tough on crime. No one wants to be seen as the prosecutor who releases someone who goes on to commit murder. This is a place where being patient is perpetuating injustice and inequality. And at a certain point, being patient enough to look at the institutions and figure out the ones where you really need to make significant change is important. Another one might be the Me Too movement. I'm an educator. I educate lots and lots of young women. I'm involved with all sorts of efforts to help young women in the tech industry, to help young women sort of find career paths. And that's sort of the slow incremental change to institutions. But there's a culture of sexual harassment in a lot of industries that probably does require revolutionary change and is probably going to be very painful, particularly for people who find themselves ousted from jobs. But I don't know that patient incrementalism gets us there. So I'm with you that it's a moment where it may be easier to be sort of angry and hot. And I'm also even with you on your sort of arguments that it's incredibly important to be deeply thoughtful about systems, and that can require sort of cool patience. What I'm also trying to make an argument for is that there's probably also that moment to say, no, actually, we really need to radically rethink this. And this is a book essentially about celebrating the process of radically rethinking institutions that aren't fit for purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me check the time here. Okay. Let me take that to kind of one of the central
Please.
Pieces of your book that I found very, very illuminating. And that is when you talk about the levers of change that are available to movements, activists today. And you point to 4 of them.
Yep.
You say most people, when they think of the focus of activism, it's the laws. You want to change the laws. And that's certainly true in some cases. But you also point out, and for one thing, is sometimes laws can be very, very, very difficult to change, particularly if the government actually is paralyzed. But there's also norms, social norms, in other words, markets, and what you call code, which is broader than that. It's really design, product design, or design of
Technology,
systems or whatever. And so it does seem to me that a lot of what you were just talking about works best when it comes to changing norms, that very hot, passionate thing, which is very, very important. And as some of the examples show, this can actually be the best way. You don't have to wait for politicians to change things. You can get people to change, and then it becomes moot. But nevertheless, I guess the focus on norms, the focus on people, which can be very, very powerful. It also strikes me that there is, if it's not followed up with a kind of understanding of what kind of long-term structural institutional changes do we also need to make, then you can get into what's sometimes called, and I don't like the term, but slacktivism, or something that I've retweeted or reposted or something, and now that means I've done something. And maybe you have, by the way.
Yeah.
But how do you make sure that all the levers that are necessary to be pulled are get pulled?
Right. So the four levers framework is something that I've adopted from my friend Larry Lessig. And Lessig wrote about this as a way of sort of understanding why computer code might be important. He said, look, there's four ways we regulate societies. We pass laws so that we say it's legal or illegal, you can do it or not do it. We use markets. We make some things expensive, we make other things cheap. Cigarettes are pretty expensive right now. It's probably a good time to quit. We use social norms. We shun you or we bless you. If you stand up and start reciting political speeches in the middle of Tunnel City Coffee in Williamstown, you will face some social sanctions because you are a norm breaker in one fashion or another. And he introduces this fourth one. He points out that technologies can let us do something or not let us do something. They're also tools for control. One of the things I spent a lot of time on was thinking about sort of turning that inside out and essentially saying, well, we know that we can pass laws to make social change, but it's clear that we can do the other three as well. And I think it's also clear that what you really want to do is try to move those four levers in parallel. So let me give an example around climate change, right? The US did not make a lot of progress on climate change over the last 4 years. We pulled out of the Paris agreements. We rolled back the Obama era fuel standards. Now they're coming back in again. That was a moment where it was hard to make change through law. It'd be really nice if we had a carbon market, a carbon tax, so on and so forth. Haven't had much progress there. What we have had, though, are amazing market and technological changes, right? We've seen rooftop solar become reasonable and sort of set up in a way that it's financeable. It's no longer a big barrier to entry to get into. We've seen huge innovation around electric cars. And Elon Musk, for all of his many negative sides, has been sort of remarkable at making Tesla sexy and getting people thinking that maybe their next car will be electric. And then you also have some really interesting norms change. I put solar panels on my roof about 5 years ago. Was it a completely intelligent economic decision made out of rationality? No, not entirely. A lot of my neighbors put them up. I was starting to feel like I would be the last guy on the block who hadn't made the move to solar, and that sort of norms-based pressure sort of acted together. You put those things together and you can have a social movement that can move on one axis while it's stalled in another one, but jointly it can move together. And what I'm trying to do more than anything else is sort of make the case for the legitimacy of those different levers and the need to work in them together. You mentioned slacktivism, which was an argument that I'm sure we found ourselves, having probably 10 years ago. My friend Evgeny Morozov, came out and sort of argued that there is no real activism except protest in person. Everything else is slacktivism. And the answer is no. There's lots of dumb, ill-informed online activism that doesn't do anything. But one thing that online activism, if done intelligently, is it can work on social norms. And working on social norms is incredibly important. You can see this right now around trying to get pressure on China regarding the Uyghur population. You don't normally see Americans stand up for Muslim rights. That's not, necessarily strongly within our recent political history, but you're actually seeing a very thoughtful movement, in part put together by young people, trying to expose that and then trying to figure out how to use legal and then possibly trade and economic sanctions that start moving on that issue. So it's not, in no way am I arguing for supremacy of change through social media. What I am arguing for is for completeness of the toolkit. And then I think the other thing that I'm arguing for is that if we want young people in particular not to drop out of social change at all, telling them that they're doing it wrong is probably the wrong place to start. And that if we can look at it instead and say, that's great, what are other levers that you could sort of put into this? And how could we make this change? How can we think about institutions' role in that change? That's a much better way to harness that energy.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. Though I'm going to put in a quick pitch for good civics education, because I'm fine with challenging institutions, but those challenges are best when they come from a standpoint of understanding of the institution challenging. And if you don't understand them, then they become this mystery, and that's where you can see lots of conspiracies going on.
Let's go back to the civil rights movement for a moment, just because it's useful to sort of think about within this. One of the things we talk about, political scientists talk a lot about this notion of efficacy. And efficacy basically means, do you feel like you can make change in the world? And political scientists talked about the civil rights movement as having very high internal efficacy, which is to say the people who were organizing knew their civics. They understood how politics worked. They had the details down. There's wonderful studies of the March on Washington that points out that the sandwiches at the March on Washington had mustard instead of mayonnaise, because people were worried that mayonnaise might spoil and lead to food poisoning in the heat. Now, people who are thinking on that level of detail, it's not ignorance that is working with them.
Right.
But the civil rights leaders, in many cases, have what they call low external efficacy. They felt like they did not have a lot of power to push people in positions of power. They felt like they did not have a lot of ability to get heard by white political leaders. And so in a case like that, you start saying, well, maybe there are other ways that I can push. And you end up with something like the Montgomery bus boycott, where you don't actually have to be successful through formal civic systems that are closed to you. You can find another way to make a change, in this case through market pressure, in a way that doesn't require the institution to respond to you. So you're absolutely right. You need that level of internal efficacy to understand how institutions actually work. But you also have to be open to the notion that sometimes those institutions are frozen and closed to you. Right. So much of this book ends up talking about minority-based movements, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the gay rights movement, because these are groups that are always looking from the outside and essentially saying, this formal path towards change might be closed towards me. Are there other paths that I can take? And I think there's an enormous amount to be learned from that outsider perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me, I could go on, but I've noticed many questions.
Yeah, why don't we bring Ben in and maybe moderate some of those questions from the floor.
Yeah. So Ben, there he is.
Thank you, gentlemen. This has been great. We do have a lot of questions, so let's get in it. And I'll try to sort and combine here because we have
that'd be great.
Themes going on. But one thing that a couple people raised is when we talk about the approval ratings and trust in government at the federal level, could you talk a little bit about approval of trust, both at more local level and more local government level, and then also we had questions about whether these trends are also seen in other countries throughout the world.
Yeah, so let me start with the other countries one, and then sort of move on to the questions of locality. So this problem of mistrust in institutions is endemic to mature democracies. It's not true of all of them. There are some mature democracies that are actually quite high trust. Scandinavia, Germany, both come up as very high trust. But there's a whole lot of mature democracies in Europe and in Asia that are actually quite low trust. Japan, which is a very mature democracy, actually comes up lower in trust than the United States is. What's really weird there is that there's a lot of high interpersonal trust. Japanese people trust each other a lot, but they don't really trust their institutions, and that's pretty interesting. Southern Europe in particular, Spain, Italy, extremely low trust sort of within those countries. One thing that we are seeing internationally around trust, well, two things really quickly. There's a number of fairly closed societies that actually have pretty high trust. And this is a real issue for people who study trust. China is a very high trust country. The explanations given range from, well, no one wants to tell you that they don't trust the government in China. That would be an unwise thing to say. Up through China's going for an enormous economic boom, and you have a huge population that was facing rural poverty that's now facing a much higher quality of life. Nothing succeeds like success. That sort of comes into play. One thing that's been super interesting in the wake of the pandemic is that government success in tackling COVID has been directly correlated to trust. We've seen an enormous boom in New Zealand, which has done very well. Taiwan, which has traditionally been a fairly low trust country, it's a country that actually overthrew its government in 2014, is now quite high trust due to COVID response. So there is this possibility that institutions which lose a lot of trust at a moment of failure can also really step up and have a wave of trust, which is great. The question about locality is a wise one. And generally speaking, we trust institutions on the local level much better than we do on the state or federal level. But here's a piece of it. In many cases, what we're trusting is an individual rather than the institution, right? So there's a well-known paradox. Everybody likes their congressperson, but they hate Congress. And what happens is once we start getting local, we are less influenced by a faceless institution and more influenced by the actual faces we have attached to it. The other thing is that we tend to be less conventionally political. When you run a mayoral election in Pittsfield, it's not a Dems versus Republicans election. That has a lot to do with the political skew of our county. But most small towns don't run partisan mayoral elections in part because there isn't particularly a Democratic or Republican way to fill potholes. It doesn't fit especially neatly along those sorts of political lines. And so I do think there's more trust when it comes to local institutions. I think what's tricky about that is that it's possible to get involved with local institutions, have influence there, and not necessarily take seriously enough these problems at the federal level or these problems at an international level. And I think COVID's been a really great example of that. We've done quite well in terms of local response, but there's a limit to what you can do in Berkshire County or a limit to what you can do in Massachusetts or even New England when you're facing something that is a truly global problem. And so local isn't necessarily the way out of the mistrust equation, even if it helps in terms of having a way to enter into civic life.
That's great. I don't know, Nick, if you want to comment, hop on. Otherwise, I'll
No, you can go.
Okay, there's been a lot of chatter here about, which is a good segue, but also the anti-vaccine movement and the interplay of the anti-vaccine movement and social media. And also one of our guests talks about the massive for-profit enterprises that are promoting vaccine misinformation out there. And maybe you can dive a little bit more into this topic, just because there seems to be a lot of.
I actually, I'd love, Nick, I'd love to hear you on this, and maybe let me frame it sort of specifically. We're seeing this move through defamation suits, actually, to try to enforce higher quality information, at least within mainstream media, right? So if we have this possibility that Fox News and OAN and these various different outlets end up being sued for defamation around, in this case, electoral fraud, that feels like it could really sort of change a landscape, both for the good and for the bad, around how mis and disinformation flows. We haven't seen people doing that on anti-vax information yet. I can't help but feel like that's potentially around the corner. You've been an advocate for careful thinking and for high quality information. Do you have thoughts about sort of how some of those media shifts are coming into play?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very interesting when you look at, taking the legal route to policing information. And I actually, I have a great deal of sympathy for with the voting machines. And it does seem to me that if you're fast and loose with information that you basically know is made up and it does damage to a company or to a person, then it does strike me as a powerful way to kind of offset that, is by taking people to court. And I would go further. I think this inevitably leads to a discussion of the infamous Section 230 of the Digital Communications Bill back in the 1990s, which basically protected internet companies, protected them from what appeared on their sites or on their services, on their networks, and also protected them from any consequences for making decisions about what to remove or what to leave up. And it seems to me that, at the time, back when we were in the grip of both thinking that, having all this information communication could only be good. And so let's not get in the way. And also let's make sure that the US tech companies kind of win this battle. So let's not get in their way. That made sense. It does seem to me, given all the problems that we've seen with misinformation, disinformation, also with kind of manipulation by companies like Facebook, the exploitation of personal data, it seems to me that we should open the gates to litigation, because I really think that it's time for the public interest to be imposed on these companies and on their systems. And it seems to me that, one way to do that is through laws. And I think there's laws and regulations that can be done. But also part of our government is the judicial system. And it's going to be a mess, but it's a mess already. And it seems to me that pushing some of this into the legislatures, into the judicial system, and let it be a mess for a while, I have a feeling we'd come out of that in a better place than we're in right now.
So let me give you sort of an insurrectionist response to that, right? So, and I suspect this happens for you too, right? I try to take my own advice in my books, and I hope that I am somewhat of a transformed individual by the time that I write them. Throughout writing Mistrust, I really sort of went back and forth a little bit about, do I believe in sort of revolutionary change? Do I believe in working within institutions? Where do I sort of come out on this? I ended up coming out and saying, I do think there are some institutions that are so broken that we have to start re-envisioning and rebuilding them. And for me, one of those institutions is social media. I think that these systems that we've built are really ungovernable. I can't imagine a good way that Facebook can somehow have community standards for a community of 2 billion people. Even if we manage to figure out how to deal with disinformation in English focused on an American population, we are not doing very well with disinformation in Burmese focused in Myanmar. And for me, where this really comes down to is you actually need to rethink the whole way you build these things. Online communities need to be shaped a lot more like human communities. We have human communities that range between maybe 20 to maybe 20,000 people. We don't have any human communities that are 2 billion people. And so if you start rethinking and rebuilding social media in ways where all of us belong to a bunch of different communities, we belong to different human communities, our church, our neighborhood, the academic circles we're in, and we actually have a role in governing them. So rather than having someone in the Philippines with a 3-ring binder trying to decide whether our speech is allowable or not, we're actually involved in the process of trying to figure out how to sanction the wrongdoer or how to deal with that conversation. So that's actually what I'm working on over at UMass. That's what my new lab is about, is looking at this problem of, is social media fixable, and sort of answering that the answer may be possibly by getting much, much smaller, much, much more democratic, and by directly designing spaces that have sort of a civic intent, a community intent towards them. How does this help us on misinformation right now? It doesn't immediately. You're going to change the landscape over time. In the short term, you may well be right. There are going to be smart conversations about CDA 230 over the next few years. There's old bearded internet people like me who react to any change to 230 with a lot of nervousness. But I think we're all seeing cases where platforms aren't taking the sort of responsibility that you would need an actor to take. And I do think we're going to see a shift from platforms seeing themselves in terms of public good, right? I think some of the information, the misinformation that was being spread about voter fraud, misinformation around COVID, you actually saw platforms start standing up and saying, we're not going to let this spread. Public health, public safety is more important than a narrow vision of free speech. Someone just pointed out in the chat that litigation and law is absolutely one of the levers that I'm advocating for. Absolutely. I think we're going to see a change that has something to do with new technologies and models, that has to do with people realizing that Facebook is not the only game in town. Maybe it's worthwhile to be part of a hyperlocal network, as well as legal change around some of these issues.
Just one quick comment. I mean, I think in the early days of social media, or even pre-social media, you know, information flows on the internet in general, there was a cult of self-regulation, that we don't have to have heavy-handed, top-down decision makers determining what's good information, what's bad information. The people on these platforms, through upvoting or downvoting or reputational systems, will take care of all that. And I think the big internet companies, particularly in the early days, kind of used that as this kind of naive, in my view, way to say, don't get involved here. You know, we'll get these systems right, and then people will vote on what's misinformation, what's not, and everything will kind of come out in the wash. That did not happen. And so I'm a little bit suspicious of saying, well, we'll architect these systems so they can be self-regulating. I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah. You know, and that's part of why we experiment and we try different things. I think no one sane is arguing for pure self-regulation. One of the things that I'm sort of thinking about are, what are resources that we've learned about social media that you need to have? It turns out you need really strong protections against things like child pornography, and you actually need to have giant shared indices so that anyone who's running a platform can check and sort of say, nope, don't post that image. And in fact, if we can find out who that user is, we need to alert law enforcement to the fact that someone's trying to post that image. There may be the combination of large-scale cooperative systems as well as small-scale systems that get us there. I think, Nick, where I'm challenging you a little bit is, I think you know as well as I do that litigating our way out of the misinformation crisis is going to be messy and nasty and thorny. And I'm not saying that it can't be part of the equation, but I think another part of the equation has to be saying, does this institution just not work? I think Facebook may just not work the way that it's built right now. And having the ability to look at something and say, maybe we need to reconceive that. Maybe that was the best that we could do in 2006. Maybe we need something actually quite different now. That's really the provocation of the book. Are there systems where we would benefit from looking at this and saying, that's just not the way that this should work anymore? Maybe there's something else that works in its place.
I certainly agree with you there.
Ben, what else you got for us?
A great one just popped up, and I think you argue, as we've seen, that the markets can be good. The market structure of social media may be the problem. Can you think of another way social media can be capitalized in a way that prioritizes truth and the social good?
Yeah, I don't know that capitalizing it is actually the way to go. One of the first things that I would try to do with social media is make the argument that we often have functions that are important enough to a society that we don't choose to make money off of it all the time. So one of the models that I'm looking to for the future of social media is public media. One of the things we found in the United States, we had this explosion of television in the 1950s and 1960s. Not a lot of it was particularly good for children. We had a lot of crooked quiz shows and lots of things going on that left people asking questions about the media. And then you have Newt Minow as the FCC commissioner show up in 1961, take a look at television and say, if you watch a day of this, what you will see is a vast wasteland. Minow, to his credit, didn't try to shut down what was there, right? People actually worried that he would. For those of you old enough to remember Gilligan's Island, you may remember the ship that runs aground is the SS Minnow. That's actually the producers of Gilligan's Island taking a swing at the FCC commissioner because they're worried that Minnow is going to take them off the air because they're light TV rather than serious TV. Minnow, to his great credit, says, no, what we're actually going to try to do is build complementary institutions. We're going to build the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We're going to build PBS. We're going to build NPR so that we don't just have Gilligan's Island, we also have Sesame Street. And that's really what I'm sort of looking at. I don't know that the current model of surveillance capitalism in which you are the product and we want as much data about you and we will do whatever we can to keep you clicking, I don't know that you can build something healthy within that environment. I think if you change the rules and you say, maybe small towns need to have networks. Here's one thing I would like to try. I live in Lanesboro. We have a town meeting. It's about 6 hours long. It's on the bleachers in the elementary school gym. It's really uncomfortable. There's a lot of that meeting that might benefit from having online interaction for a few days before and a few days after. Not Facebook style, not unmoderated. You'd actually want to moderate it very carefully. You'd want to make sure that no one is monopolizing the platform, but you could actually have a lot of your pre-discussion and then get together and have a much more focused town meeting and then have a discussion that sort of lasts after the fact. Now, that's not as compelling or interesting as Facebook, but it might be really interesting for the few days right around town meeting. How do we provide an environment for different spaces like that to exist? That's really the sort of stuff that I'm kind of talking about within this, and really talking about as a complement rather than just a replacement.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of experimentation in that area would be great in having these public social media. I do think, however, that due to network effects, the fact that communication systems sort of want to get really big because the more people involved, then the more valuable they get to everyone, and that's you're going to have Facebook size things, even if you have lots of local ones as well. So I do think there are ways, though, to kind of change the model, nudge the model, because I don't think it's working at all, and I don't think it's going to work with the existing model. But I think you can go back to, again, going back to look at broadcast media and how it developed, you can think about licensing, and you can think about fees on, say, data transfer. So it starts to become expensive to simply have such enormous amounts of unregulated data flows in communications, which might push some of these firms away from a sheer advertising model and more to a subscription-based model, which never really got tried out. And then there are all sorts of ways you can deal with data and personal data and putting much tighter regulations on it. I think one of the interesting things we're seeing right now is this battle between Apple and Facebook, where Apple is, to its credit, I think, trying to impose an opt-out system. And you're seeing Facebook kind of getting very weaselly about this because they know that they don't want to give you that choice. They want to take that choice away from you by simply making opt-in the default setting. And so I think there are ways to kind of change the market incentives. And this has to go back to kind of the pre-70s model of media as being something that the public has a definite interest in. And that got lost with deregulation. It got lost with a lot of technological changes that blurred the lines between personal communication and public broadcasting stuff, or just broadcasting. So this is a really, really hard problem.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think it requires us to go back to the original assumptions here in saying, maybe these assumptions were the wrong assumptions.
I think for me, Nick, that's really, it's sort of one of the core arguments in the book. I actually talk about a form of institutionalism that I call radical institutionalism, which involves looking at an institution and saying, what was this for in the first place? And maybe can we get to it? Possibly the craziest example I give in the entire book is the fact that one of the few things George Washington said about the US Constitution was that he felt it was very important for representatives to represent 30,000 people and not 40,000 people. He was worried that having one rep for 40,000 would not be sufficient, would not have that very personal relationship. If you went back to that initial 1 to 30,000 reps, you would have a House of Representatives with 11,000 representatives in it. Obviously, that would have to work very, very differently than our current House of Representatives does. But you could actually imagine 11,000 person House of Reps working virtually. It has some interesting consequences. The Electoral College basically disappears. You suddenly have one vote per elector. You actually don't need a constitutional amendment to do this. It's completely constitutional. It's just that we have not reapportioned the House since the 1920s for all sorts of complicated reasons, mostly having to do with prohibition. But a radical institutionalist would look at this and say, there might have been a reason that the founding fathers wanted the People's House to have that very small, fine-grained form of representation. We might feel very differently about Congress if we had 3 or 4 representatives for this county, rather than being part of essentially Western Massachusetts being represented by one person. So sometimes going back to those original debates and looking at the initial value behind it, and then saying, how would we take that value within a very different scenario? I think the internet's very much like that. How could we take some of those values that we were trying to design about, now informed by 30 years of a commercial internet that's had some real failures associated with it, and sort of reassess the situation that we find ourselves in?
Really fascinating. A couple for one aimed at Nick here. Can you talk a little bit about the status and need for improving critical literacy among students and the population in general? And I'm sure Ethan can chime in here as well.
Sure. I could talk for a long time about that. I do think that as I argued in the book, The Shallows, which came out 10 years ago, and I should emphasize that the book came out when laptops and desktops were still our main mode of going online. And it was already clear to me, and I think the science was beginning to back it up, that we had created a system that was optimized for providing as much information as quickly as possible without any kind of, without, we just assume that more must be better. And this is a fundamental Silicon Valley misperception. More information is better, more communication is better, more community is better. You don't have to worry about the intricacies of those things, just more is better. And if it's faster, it's better. And what we did essentially is create, I think, a crisis of attentiveness, that we bought into this media system, this technological system that actively discouraged us from contemplative thinking, from reflective thinking, from introspective thinking, and from critical thinking. Any type of thinking that requires real focus, that requires you to screen out distractions rather than let them pour in, the way the internet, as it came to be designed, does. So I think at this point, and as I say, that was 10 years ago. Then what's happened in the last 10 years is the rise of the smartphone as the dominant form of personal computer. Smartphone always connected, always within a foot of our body, basically 24 hours a day, constantly designed to constantly interrupt us. And recent studies show that even when we're not using it, when we're not getting notified, when we're not getting alerted, a significant part of our attention is still on our phone because there's so much there, and we anticipate getting new information all the time. And then add to that social media, designed from the ground up to distract us, to keep figuring out what's going to grab our attention for a moment. So I do think we have a crisis where we are not encouraging people to engage in what I consider the higher forms of thinking, which all require attentiveness. And I'm not arguing that the ideal is for people to sit in a quiet room all day and think big thoughts. I want a variety of intellectual experiences. But I do think at this point it becomes very, very hard to change the trends. But I do think that we can begin in education, and particularly early education. There's been this belief from tech companies to school boards to parents that the more technological intensity in a school, the better the school is. You want more computers per student. And slowly but surely, this is pushed all the way down to elementary school, to even kindergarten. I think we need to change and begin to think of schools more as a refuge from screen-based technology rather than an extension of it. I mean, if you think about it, does a young child really need more time in front of screens, that you want to put him or her in front of screens in school? I don't think that that's what's lacking in their lives. And it seems to me, if we think about schools in the early grades, particularly as a refuge from technology, then we can think about schools focusing on building up critical thinking, building up people's ability, students' ability to be attentive, their discipline to screen out distractions rather than being enticed by them all the time. So, it's going to take a lot more than that. But I do think kind of rethinking education to put a premium on teaching attentiveness would be a good first step.
Nicholas, I think one thing that you absolutely got right in The Shallows was the importance of attention. And I think that attention has ended up being the fundamental economic unit within the internet. And as we think about so much of what's challenging right now, whether it's misinformation, whether it's echo chambers, it's about the concentration and monetization of attention. I want to push back just on two fronts. One is that we've actually seen that particularly around these questions of mis and disinformation, it's actually the kids who are all right. The people who are spreading mis and disinformation online are our age or older. And it's, particularly endemic in folks over 65. And it's possible that part of what's going on is that as the knowledge environment is shifting, those skills of figuring out what to listen to and what not to listen to are ones that we actually develop quite young. And there seem to be some early indications that while older generations who didn't grow up understanding that anyone can publish anything are more vulnerable than younger generations who are finding ways of trying to figure out how to evaluate where the information is coming from. I will also say that I'm the parent of an 11-year-old son, and anybody who's parenting right now is watching their kids spend a lot of screen time. I will say that it's very different screen time than when I was a kid. I am watching my child work with groups of other students in his school and actually with another group of students all the way across the state on these intricate and complex projects in Minecraft that not only requires some engineering thinking, but an enormous amount of socializing and sociability. I do think there are types of thinking that we absolutely are going to have to figure out how to cultivate and make space for. But I think it's also one of these moments where it's actually really good to look at what some of these tools do well. And I think similarly in Mistrust, I'm trying to make that argument. I'm trying to make that argument that, yes, in fact, maybe we are not doing as good a job of teaching traditional civics as we might have in the 50s or 60s. But I think students and activists in particular are doing much better at other parts of this equation, like thinking about how you build narratives, how you do advocacy, how you tell stories, how you work on norms, than frankly most advocates did back in those days. So I think there's the possibility to look at these sort of moments of change and see positives and negatives at the same time.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because I've always been careful not to take a generational view of these issues. I mean, the reason I talked about schools in the younger grades is because that's where we can actually influence what goes on. I can't influence the media habits of a 55-year-old.
No, that's right.
But I do think that this issue and the influence of the internet, for better or for worse, is cross-generational. And that any adult who thinks, kids are distracted all the time and always on their phones is delusional, because they're just as bad. And so I do absolutely think it's a mistake to look at this in strict generational terms, that this is a challenge for society as a whole. And you're absolutely right that there are plenty of examples of computers and computer technology being used in very, very good ways. And I'm not doubting that. What I am saying is that the merger of computing, communications, and media has created an environment that is with us all the time now in a way that was never true, not even of television. You weren't carrying your television around in your pocket all the time. In that it is designed to feed into our desire to be information gatherers all the time. And I think this is a problem.
Ben, do you want to close this out? Do you want to, is maybe one more quick question, or should we wrap? We've taken a lot of people's time.
We're running out of time. I want to be respectful of your time and our audience. And I really appreciate where that conversation went, thinking 10 years ago, technology, present technology. I'm curious, and maybe just wrap it up in a few minutes. And you touched on this a little bit, Ethan. The benefits and some of the ways we use technology better. I have young children learning at home as well. I'm curious as to when technology moves that next step, when you're wearing your Google glasses or the screens are just incorporated. What do we have to look out for, and how do we combat and keep it,
Yeah, I'm really interested in what's going to happen when we have generations of kids who are used to reaching out to one another to solve problems. I think we're seeing some really early indicators with this when you look at the kids who survived the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And I think if you look at that crew of kids who've become activists, not only against America's gun culture, but against structural racism and the ways in which Black and Latino students were not included in the spotlight in the same way as folks like David Hogue were. I think those kids have absolutely been remarkable. And I think it's been incredible to sort of watch them, in many cases, sort of as Nick warns, very quickly and sort of ad hoc sort of build and problem solve. And I think we're going to see both strengths and weaknesses to those sorts of methods. But I am increasingly interested in sort of learning from my son's generation, learning from the kids that I'm sort of seeing at UMass, and looking to see what are maybe the unexpected strengths within these methods, as well as some of the weaknesses. So enormous problems to come. We don't have an information environment that is believable. We have problems that are frankly well beyond the informational. Part of the reason I wrote Mistrust was to make the case that it isn't just the internet that's leading us not to trust each other. The fact is, this has been going on since the 1970s. It has much bigger social forces at hand. When you have a moment where one of the two political parties, the majority of the elected representatives say that they don't believe a democratic election, that's not an information problem. That's a political problem. And one of the things that we have to be careful about here is mapping these all into the technology space. Folks like Nick and I both like to look very closely at technology because it is moving so quickly and because it can have such profound influences. Part of what I hope to do a little bit in this book was to maybe move a little bit more slowly and a little bit more historically, and sort of think about those really big social trends over the sort of 50 to 100 year movements. And I think for better or for worse, I think this move from very trusting to very untrusting is sort of one of those very big trends.
So I'll just briefly comment on the technology side itself, because I think there might be something to be learned here. I think it's very interesting that, you know, people have for some time been talking about what comes after the smartphone as the interface, and a lot of people think it's virtual reality. And it's interesting that, you know, Google Glass failed spectacularly. Virtual reality goggles have had nowhere near the uptake that people were predicting. I think there's going to be, you know, I think there will be applications for virtual reality things in you know, gaming, in training, pornography, those type of things. But I think what we're learning is that actually people are very protective of their field of vision. And even if you're looking in your smartphone all the time, you're deciding when you're going to look in your smartphone. You can look away. The moment when suddenly our field of vision is being populated by outside forces, outside companies, in a way that we don't have any control over, I think that might be the point at which we rebel and say, no, this is too much. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I do find that people are not dying to have, you know, the Facebooks of the world being information into their field of vision without them actually making some choice to do that. And this will be an interesting thing that'll play out in the near future, I think.
Nicholas Carr, Ethan Zuckerman, I can't thank you enough. This has been wonderful. Our friends at OLLI, thank you so much. And One Berkshire, thank you. Again, the book, Ethan's new book is Mistrust, Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. Congratulations, Ethan, very timely book. I know we talked about that. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Nick. And thanks, OLLI. Thanks everyone for hanging out. We really enjoyed it.